Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey, not to the epic sagas of mighty warriors or the thrilling voyages of exploration, but deep into the very heart of Viking society, the family longhouse. Imagine this, you're sitting by a smoky, central hearth. The crackle of fire, the only constant sound. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, stale animal hides, and something vaguely metallic, perhaps from a nearby forge. Around you, dozens of people, your family and kin, move about their daily chores. On the surface, it might seem like a cozy, communal existence, a place of warmth and belonging. But beneath the veneer of simple domesticity, you're about to discover why family life in the Viking Age was often truly terrible. A constant battle against harsh elements, pervasive danger, and the brutal realities of survival. You probably won't survive this without losing a few loved ones, or at least your illusion of peace. But we're going to dive into the grim reality anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you guys are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back to the Viking Age, roughly between the late 8th and mid-11th centuries. A period of immense change, exploration, and frequent violence. Your home is a longhouse, a large rectangular dwelling made of timber, turf, or stone, with a central hearth that provides heat and light, but also fills the air with constant smoke. This is where multiple generations, sometimes even multiple families of a single kindred family group, live, eat, sleep, and work together. Privacy, as you know it, is non-existent. Every aspect of your life is communal, shared, and exposed. The popular image of the Viking family might be one of rugged independence, strong bonds, and a close-knit unit facing the world together. And while strength and loyalty were certainly valued, the realities of their daily existence often put immense strain on these bonds. Life was precarious, demanding constant vigilance, endless labor, and an acceptance of harsh realities that would shock your modern sensibilities. One mainstream historical fact that utterly redefines the myth of cozy Viking domesticity is that Viking Age family life was characterized by extreme hardship, high mortality rates, especially for infants and children, constant physical labor for all family members, patriarchal authority, and a pervasive threat of famine, disease, and violence, making daily existence a relentless struggle for survival and rarely a serene domestic ideal. Their homes were shelters from the elements, but also breeding grounds for disease and sites of frequent struggle. Think about it, your idea of family bonding might be splitting firewood or mending fishing nets, not sitting around a board game. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the pragmatic and sometimes brutal nature of Viking family decisions is the practice of exposure of infants. If a newborn child was deemed too weak to survive, or if the family was facing extreme hardship and couldn't support another mouth, the father, as head of the household, had the right to decide if the child should be exposed, left outdoors to die. This was a grim but recognized practice, a desperate measure of population control in a world of limited resources and high infant mortality. Imagine having to make such an agonizing decision. Knowing it was legally and socially acceptable, historians still argue whether the practice of infant exposure in Viking Age Scandinavia was primarily a desperate economic and pragmatic response to high infant mortality and limited resources, serving as a form of natural selection, or if it also reflected a more detached societal view of infant life before a certain age or ritual naming, making it a cultural norm rather than just an act of desperation. Was it about survival or about custom that allowed for such a practice? As you navigate the longhouse, you feel the persistent dampness in the air, the cold seeping in from the stone walls, and the constant low hum of activity. Children, barely past infancy, are already tasked with small chores. Women toil relentlessly, preparing food, weaving cloth, and managing the household. Men are either working the land, tending livestock, or preparing for distant voyages of trade or raid. There is no true leisure, no concept of childhood as a protected period. Everyone contributes or struggles. The bonds within the kindred were strong, often providing the only real social safety net against a harsh world. But these bonds could also lead to fierce disputes, particularly over inheritance, property, or honor, and blood feuds. A grim reality of Viking society. Remember those from Why Justice Sucked in the Middle Ages. Section 6 could draw entire families into cycles of violence, turning neighbors and even relatives into deadly enemies. You feel the weight of shared hardship, the constant vigilance against disease and famine, and the subtle tensions that simmer beneath the surface of communal living. The longhouse, while a place of shelter, is also a crucible where lives are forged in the fires of necessity. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't about idyllic togetherness. It's about constant struggle, grim decisions, and a pervasive fragility that made every day a battle for survival, transforming even the warmth of the hearth into a stark reminder of the challenges of merely existing in their unyielding northern world. Having felt the pervasive hardship of the Viking longhouse, your understanding of family life quickly sharpens as you confront its most vulnerable members' children. This is childhood short, brutal, dangerous. Forget protected playtimes, formal schooling, or long, carefree years of innocence. Viking childhood was a precarious, often terrifying existence, marked by staggeringly high infant mortality, early entry into arduous labor, and a constant exposure to the harsh realities of survival. You quickly learn that being born into a Viking family means your very first years are a desperate gamble, and that childhood here is less a period of nurturing and more a rapid initiation into a demanding, unforgiving world. It's like being born into a perpetual survival camp, where the lessons begin as soon as you can walk, and the stakes are always life or death. You hear the quiet cries of a newborn, barely a few days old, tucked into a cradle near the hearth. But even this tiny life is not safe. You recall the grim practice of exposure we touched upon from Section 1, Introduction, Hearth, and Hardship. In a world of limited resources and harsh conditions, if a child was born weak, deformed, or simply if the family faced extreme hardship, the father, as head of the household, had the legal and societal right to decide if the infant should be exposed, left outside to die. This was a heartbreaking but recognized practice, a brutal form of family planning in an era without modern medicine or social safety nets. One mainstream historical fact that utterly shatters any romanticized notion of Viking childhood is that infant and child mortality rates in the Viking Age were exceptionally high, with estimates suggesting that a significant percentage, sometimes over 30 to 50% of children, did not survive past the age of 5 due to disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the practice of infant exposure, making early childhood a profoundly dangerous period. Survival past infancy was a true testament to resilience and luck. Think about it, every third child you see might not live to see their 5th birthday. Imagine the constant anxiety of a Viking parent. Every cough, every fever, every fall could spell doom for a young child, especially given the rampant diseases which we'll explore later. Section 6 and rudimentary medical care available. Life in the Longhouse, while communal, was also filled with dangers, open fires, sharp tools, large animals, and the ever-present threat of accidents in a busy, unpadded environment. A moment of inattention could lead to a severe burn, a crippling injury, or a swift, agonizing death. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the Viking perspective on childhood development is the idea that children, particularly boys, were often encouraged to engage in rough and tumble play, including mock fighting with blunt weapons, from a very young age. This wasn't just for fun. It was seen as crucial training for developing physical prowess, resilience, and martial skills, preparing them for their future roles as warriors or farmers. Imagine giving your toddler a blunt axe to play with, because it's important for his future career in raiding. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism and hardiness attributed to adult Vikings was primarily a result of this harsh upbringing and the selective pressure of high childhood mortality, meaning only the strongest survived, or if there was also a nurturing, albeit practical, side to Viking parenting that focused on preparing children for the realities of their challenging world through experiential learning rather than overt cruelty. Did it create tough adults, or just eliminate the weak? As soon as a child could walk, they were expected to contribute. Even young children, barely out of infancy, would be tasked with small chores, fetching water, gathering firewood, tending to younger siblings, or helping with basic tasks around the farm. There was no concept of leisure time for children. No dedicated period for pure play or intellectual development as you understand it. Every pair of hands, however small, was needed for the survival of the household. Formal schooling. Like that in ancient Greece, remember those grammatists and pedagogos from our Ancient Greece segment was largely absent. Children learned by doing, by observing their elders, and by participating directly in the daily rhythms of longhouse life. Boys would learn farming, hunting, fishing, and basic martial skills from their fathers and older male relatives. Girls would learn household management, cooking, weaving, and childcare from their mothers and older female relatives. Their education was entirely practical, dictated by the demands of survival. The mental and emotional toll on children, growing up in such an environment, must have been immense. They witnessed death frequently, from infant siblings to family members lost to disease or violence. They endured hunger, cold, and constant physical discomfort. Yet, they also developed a profound resilience, a deep understanding of their world, and an unbreakable bond with their surviving family members. You feel the sharp chill in the air of the longhouse, the constant hum of daily labor, and the pervasive sense of a childhood cut short, defined by immediate practicalities rather than idyllic innocence. You watch a child, barely able to lift a small bucket, carrying water to the hearth, their small face grim with concentration. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about the hardships of adults. It's about the brutal reality of childhood. Your existence as a Viking child would be precarious, short, and dangerous, marked by high mortality and early entry into a demanding life, ensuring that only the hardiest, most adaptable individuals survived to carry on the family name, a grim but vital inheritance in their unyielding northern world. Having glimpsed the brutal reality of Viking childhood, Your understanding of family life next confronts the foundation of Viking households' marriage: strategic, practical. Forget romantic notions of love matches and elaborate ceremonies, though those existed. To a degree, in the Viking Age, marriage was overwhelmingly a practical alliance, a crucial economic and social contract between two families, designed to consolidate power, secure resources, or settle disputes. You quickly learn that your choice of spouse might have little to do with personal affection and everything to do with land, livestock, and alliances, turning one of life's most intimate relationships into a calculated negotiation. It's like entering a business merger, but the assets being combined are two families, and the deal is sealed with a wedding feast. You observe a wedding celebration in the longhouse. The sounds are boisterous feasting, drinking, and the exchange of gifts. But beneath the surface of merriment, you sense the underlying seriousness of the transaction. This isn't just about two individuals joining. It's about two kindred's family groups forging a bond, strengthening their collective power, and increasing their chances of survival in a harsh world. The discussions leading up to the marriage would have been lengthy, involving the heads of both families meticulously negotiating terms. One mainstream historical fact that utterly contrasts with modern romantic ideals of marriage is that Viking Age marriages were fundamentally strategic and economic alliances between families, negotiated by the male heads of households godar or chieftains, involving property dowry from the bride's family, dower from the groom's, reciprocal obligations, and often aimed at consolidating wealth, power, or resolving feuds, with personal affection often secondary to pragmatic considerations. Love was a bonus, not a prerequisite. Think about it, your family's future could literally depend on who you marry. Imagine the negotiations. Your father, as the head of your kindred, would discuss the bride price or dowry hemenfilgia from the bride's family. What property, goods, or wealth she brought to the marriage. He would also negotiate the dower munder from the groom's family, property that the husband settled upon the wife, which became her personal property. These were serious financial transactions, meticulously debated, as they determined the economic security of the bride and the new household. The wealth exchanged was a crucial element of the alliance, not just a symbolic gesture. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the distinct nature of Viking marriage is the relatively strong legal position of women regarding their dowry. Unlike some other medieval societies, a Viking woman generally retained ownership of her dowry throughout the marriage, and if the marriage ended in divorce, she would take her dowry with her, providing her with a degree of economic independence and security. Imagine a prenuptial agreement that explicitly states you keep all your premarital assets, and it's backed by centuries of legal custom. Historians still argue whether the apparent ease of divorce in Viking Age society, where either husband or wife could initiate it under certain conditions, truly reflected a more egalitarian or flexible approach to marital bonds, allowing for personal autonomy within a practical framework, or if it was primarily a pragmatic mechanism for families to dissolve unfavorable alliances or escape abusive situations, making it a functional tool for family survival rather than an expression of individual choice or romantic freedom. Did it empower women, or merely offer a practical escape hatch for families? Beyond property, alliances were key. A marriage could bring powerful new allies to your family, strengthening your kindred against rivals or providing crucial support in a blood feud. Remember those from our Viking Justice script. It could secure access to valuable trade routes, new lands, or specific resources. Your marriage was a political act, woven into the intricate web of Viking social dynamics. Divorce, while often viewed as scandalous in later Christian societies, was surprisingly accessible in the Viking Age, particularly in Iceland and Norway. Either a husband or wife could initiate a divorce under certain conditions: cruelty, impotence, physical abuse, or even simply wearing a garment deemed too masculine for a wife or too feminine for a husband in public. Depending on local custom, the process often involved a public declaration of divorce before witnesses and the division of property. While it was not without social consequences, it offered a legal escape from an unhappy or unproductive union, allowing individuals and families to seek new alliances. The concept of romantic love, while perhaps existing, was rarely the primary driver of these unions. Marriage was a partnership, a practical arrangement for managing a household. Raising children, those tenacious survivors from Section 2, and ensuring the continuation of the family line. Affection might grow over time, but it wasn't the initial foundation. You feel the weight of family expectation, the subtle pressure to find a suitable match, and the constant awareness that your marriage is not just about your own happiness, but about the prosperity and security of your entire kindred. You participate in the wedding feast, knowing that this alliance, however forged, is a crucial bond in a world of constant hardship. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't about grand romantic gestures. It's about the pragmatic, strategic reality of marriage. Your union is a calculated alliance, a vital economic and social contract, transforming one of life's most personal experiences into a powerful tool for family survival and communal strength, ensuring that even love was a secondary consideration to the enduring bonds of necessity. Having understood the strategic, often unromantic, foundation of Viking marriage, your gaze now turns to the tireless, indispensable figures who truly kept the longhouse running, women's labor endless toil. Forget the demure ladies of later eras. In the Viking Age, women, whether wives, daughters, or thralls, were the backbone of the household economy, performing a relentless array of arduous, essential tasks from dawn till dusk, ensuring the very survival of the family. You quickly learn that a Viking woman's life was a continuous cycle of demanding physical work, management, and resourcefulness, a testament to her strength and resilience in a world that offered little respite. It's like being the CEO, COO, head chef, master weaver, and primary caregiver for a very large, very demanding, perpetually hungry, and unhygienic household, all at the same time. You observe the women in the longhouse, often working from early morning until late into the night. Their clothes are simple, practical, and often stained from their labors. Their hands, though perhaps smaller than a man's, are calloused and strong, accustomed to a bewildering variety of tasks. Their movements are purposeful, efficient, reflecting a lifetime of managing the complex ecosystem of a Viking household. One mainstream historical fact that utterly redefines the role of Viking women is that Viking Age women, particularly wives, held immense practical authority within the household husfreyja, managing all domestic production, food preparation, textile creation, and often the care of livestock, performing continuous, arduous labor that was absolutely vital for the family's economic survival and well-being, especially during the men's frequent absences. Their contribution was not merely supportive, it was fundamentally essential. Think about it, without her, the family literally doesn't eat. Imagine the sheer volume of daily chores. Your day would begin long before the men were ready for work in the fields. You would be responsible for preparing breakfast, that coarse porridge and flatbread. Remember that from Section 2. milking cows or goats and processing that milk into skyr, cheese, or butter, from Section 5, and tending to the central fire, ensuring it provided heat for warmth and cooking, despite its smoke. Children, those tough little survivors from Section 2, would be under your primary care as you fed them, clothed them, and initiated them into their own early chores. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the meticulous and often continuous nature of their textile work is the constant process of spinning and weaving wool. Medieval clothing was made of wool, and every thread, every piece of fabric, was made by hand. Women would spend countless hours at the distaff and spindle, twisting raw wool into yarn, and then at the loom, weaving that yarn into cloth for tunics, cloaks, and blankets. Imagine trying to make all your family's clothes from scratch, by hand, starting from raw sheep's wool, often for dozens of family members, as a constant background task throughout your entire life. Historians still argue whether the apparent high status and legal rights afforded to Viking women, like property ownership and the right to divorce. Remember, Section 3 were primarily due to their undeniable and essential economic contributions to the household, making them indispensable partners, or if it was also a reflection of pre-Christian Germanic traditions that inherently granted women more autonomy than later Christianized societies. Did their labor earn them rights, or did their culture provide them? Food preparation was a ceaseless task. You'd be cooking that tough. Preserved meat from Section 3 and bland fish from Section 4, often requiring long hours of soaking, boiling, and stewing over an open fire. Grinding grain by hand with a quernstone was a daily, physically demanding chore. During the autumn slaughter from Section 3, your work would intensify dramatically, as you oversaw the preparation and preservation, salting, smoking, drying, fermenting of massive quantities of meat for winter. Beyond the hearth, you were responsible for managing the household stores, overseeing the root cellar. Remember that from Section 10 of Terrible Diet, checking the smokehouse, and ensuring enough provisions were laid in for the long winter. You supervised the thralls, enslaved individuals, whom we'll discuss later, if your family had them, directing their labor in the domestic sphere. You also tended to the sick and injured, relying on traditional herbal remedies and your own practical nursing skills with no modern medical care. Remember those primitive Roman doctors. The work was constant, from sunup to sundown, with no holidays or weekends as you know them, even in the dead of winter, when outdoor work might slow. The indoor tasks of weaving, mending, and preparing preserved food continued relentlessly. There was no escaping the demands of the longhouse, your very existence a testament to unending labor. You feel the persistent ache in your back, the calluses on your hands, and the bone-deep weariness that accompanies a life of relentless physical toil. You breathe in the constant wood smoke, the damp chill, and the pervasive smells of the longhouse, knowing that your tireless efforts are the invisible foundation upon which your family's very survival rests. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't about grand sagas of men. It's about the endless toil of women. Your life as a Viking woman is a continuous, demanding cycle of essential labor, transforming you into the indispensable heart of the household, ensuring that the warmth of the hearth and the survival of the kindred were secured through your unceasing, unglamorous, and utterly vital daily grind. Even as the women of the Longhouse toiled relentlessly to manage the household and ensure daily survival, their lives, and indeed the entire family's well-being, were constantly shaped by another pervasive reality: men's absence raids and trade. Forget the comforting presence of a stable patriarchal figure. For much of the year, the men of the family, fathers, husbands, brothers, would be absent, embarking on long, perilous voyages of trade, exploration, or raiding, leaving the women and remaining family members to face the constant dangers and immense responsibilities of life without their primary protectors and providers. You quickly learn that your family's prosperity and its very survival depended on these dangerous journeys, turning every farewell into a profound gamble with separation, anxiety, and potential widowhood. It's like living in a constant state of wartime deployment, but your soldiers are also your main source of income, and you never know if they'll come back or what they'll bring if they do. You stand by the shore, watching the longships glide away, their single square sails billowing in the wind, carrying the men of your family, your kindred, towards the open sea. The air is filled with the shouts of farewell, the creak of timber, and the splash of oars. Your heart is heavy with a mixture of pride, anxiety, and a profound sense of foreboding. You know these journeys are long, dangerous, and uncertain. These aren't short trips. A trading voyage could take months, a raiding expedition even longer, stretching from spring through autumn, or even into multiple years for ambitious voyages to distant lands like Greenland or North America. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the impact of this absence on family life is that Viking Age men, particularly during the warmer months, were frequently absent from home for extended periods due to long-distance trade, seasonal farming, exploration, or raiding expeditions, placing immense responsibility on women to manage households, farmsteads, and often the entire community, while simultaneously facing constant anxieties about their men's safety and return. The Viking lifestyle inherently meant long periods of male absence. Think about it. Your husband could be gone for a year, and you'd have no way of knowing if he's alive. Imagine the immense responsibilities that fall upon the women left behind. Without the men, you are now entirely responsible for the farmstead managing the livestock, overseeing the thralls if your family had them, ensuring the fields are properly cultivated, and dealing with any disputes that arise within the community. The workload intensifies dramatically. Remember that endless toil of women's labor from Section 4. Every decision, from how much grain to plant to how to deal with a sick animal, rests on your shoulders, without the immediate counsel of the male head of the household. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights the women's critical role during these absences is their authority to host feasts and manage social gatherings in the men's stead. Serving as the de facto head of the household in social contexts. This wasn't just entertaining, it was a way to maintain the family's social standing and alliances while the men were away. Imagine being left in charge of the family's entire social calendar, including hosting elaborate banquets, all while simultaneously running the entire farm and hoping your husband doesn't get eaten by a sea monster. Historians still argue whether the long periods of male absence, by forcing women to take on extensive managerial and economic roles, inadvertently contributed to the comparatively higher status and legal rights of Viking women, like property ownership and the right to divorce. Remember Section 3 compared to their contemporaries in other European societies, or if their legal standing was primarily due to pre-existing cultural traditions that already valued women's contributions highly. Regardless of male absence, did their absence empower women, or just highlight existing strengths? The anxiety is constant. You scan the horizon daily, hoping for the sight of a familiar sail. Rumors might reach your village of storms at sea, of clashes with foreign peoples, or of longships lost without a trace. There's no way to send messages, no way to know if your husband, father, or brother is safe, injured, or already lost to the depths. The uncertainty is a slow, agonizing torment, transforming every passing day into a test of your endurance. The dangers to the community itself are also heightened. Without the men, the village is more vulnerable to raids from rival Viking groups, or even from desperate bandits. The remaining men, often older or less able-bodied, must organize defenses. But the primary protectors are away. You live with a constant, low-level fear for your safety, knowing that your vulnerability is increased with every day the longships are absent. If the men return, the joy is immense, a triumphant reunion. They might bring back exotic goods from distant lands, a new influx of wealth, though the pay and reward for pirates, from Section 10 of Assassin's Life Sucked, was often meager and tainted, and even Viking plunder might be less than glorious. But if they don't return, if their ship is lost to a storm or their lives claimed by battle, the consequences are devastating. You become a widow, your children fatherless, your family's future cast into immediate uncertainty. The harshness of Viking life meant that being a widow or an orphan, we'll discuss this later, was a common and terrifying reality. You feel the hollow ache of absence, the constant worry for your loved ones, and the profound burden of managing the entire household alone. You scan the waves, hoping for the sight of a distant sail, knowing that your entire future hinges on its return. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about the hardships endured together. It's about the prolonged, dangerous periods of men's absence. Your life is a continuous gamble with separation, anxiety, and profound responsibility, transforming every voyage into a terrifying act of faith, ensuring that your family's survival and your own peace of mind were perpetually at the mercy of the vast, unforgiving sea and the perils of distant lands. Even as the longships disappear over the horizon, leaving women and children to manage the homestead and grapple with the anxieties of male absence, an insidious, unseen enemy constantly stalked the very heart of the Viking family. Disease, Longhouse's scourge. Forget modern sanitation, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of germ theory. The crowded, smoky, and often unsanitary conditions within the Longhouse created a perfect breeding ground for a horrifying array of infections, turning your family home into a literal hotbed of illness that could sweep through your kin with terrifying efficiency, often claiming the lives of the most vulnerable. You quickly learn that your greatest foe isn't always the sword of a raider, but the invisible killers lurking in the air you breathe and the spaces you share, making every cough or fever a potential death sentence. It's like living in a permanent, very cozy, but utterly contaminated Petri dish, where every family gathering is also a potential super spreader event. You cough, a dry, persistent rasp, and glance at your infant sibling, who is also wheezing faintly in their cradle near the central hearth. The air inside the Longhouse is thick with wood smoke from the central fire, providing heat but little ventilation, mingling with the pervasive smell of unwashed bodies. Remember, hygiene shared filth from Section 14 in the outline. We'll dive into that later, but it's present from day one. Stale food, and the lingering odor of livestock often housed at one end of the structure. You are crammed in with dozens of family members, sometimes multiple nuclear families, living, eating, and sleeping in incredibly close quarters. There's no privacy, no personal space, and certainly no concept of social distancing. One mainstream historical fact that utterly shatters any romanticized notion of robust Viking health is that Viking Age populations suffered from extremely high rates of infectious diseases, including tuberculosis, pneumonia, dysentery, and various fevers, exacerbated by overcrowded, smoky, and unsanitary living conditions within longhouses, lack of clean water, and rudimentary medical knowledge, leading to a significantly reduced lifespan and high mortality, especially among children. Disease was a far more common killer than combat. Think about it, that smoky, warm longhouse, your shelter from the cold, was also a constant source of sickness. Imagine the rapid spread. When one family member falls ill, whether with a hacking cough, a debilitating fever, or agonizing dysentery. The close proximity within the longhouse ensures that the illness quickly sweeps through everyone else. Children, with their less developed immune systems, remember high infant mortality from Section 2, are particularly vulnerable, often succumbing swiftly. You would see your siblings, your cousins, your parents, struck down by invisible scourges, their bodies racked with fever or consumed by diarrhea. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the Vikings' pragmatic and often fatalistic approach to illness is the common reliance on various folk remedies and charms to ward off disease rather than effective medical treatment. This might include drinking strange herbal concoctions, wearing specific amulets, or performing small personal rituals to appease malevolent spirits believed to cause sickness. Imagine trying to cure a severe bacterial infection by rubbing a rabbit's foot and drinking a potion made of boiled bark, desperately hoping it would work, when all you really needed was better hygiene. Historians still argue whether the consistent exposure to diverse pathogens in their everyday environment from animals, shared spaces, and trade contacts might have inadvertently led to some level of collective immunity within Viking communities, making them more resilient to certain diseases than more isolated populations. Or if this constant exposure simply meant they were always battling a high pathogenic load, leading to a perpetually low state of health and energy. Did it make them stronger, or just constantly sick? The omnipresent smoke from the central hearth, while providing warmth, also filled the air with irritating particulate matter, contributing to chronic respiratory problems like bronchitis and asthma. Your lungs would constantly ache, and the familiar Viking cough would be a common sound throughout the longhouse, a constant background noise to your lives. Water sources, drawn from wells or nearby streams, were often contaminated by human and animal waste, leading to rampant outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid, recalling water-contaminated deadly from Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Ancient Egypt. Section 4. Food, especially preserved items, could also carry pathogens if not handled or stored correctly, or if rodents and insects remember those from Section 7 of Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in Ancient Egypt infested the stores. Medical care, when available, was rudimentary. Healers relied on traditional herbal remedies, bone setting, and basic wound care. There was no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or the importance of sterile practices. A simple cut could quickly fester into a fatal infection. A common cold could turn into life-threatening pneumonia. Your body's own resilience, or sheer luck, was often your best and only defense. You feel the persistent irritation in your throat, the occasional chills, and the profound, chilling realization that your home, your safe haven from the outside world, is also a constant threat to your health. You watch the small, still forms of children being carried out after succumbing to fever, or the emaciated bodies of adults wasting away from unseen internal battles. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about harsh winters or difficult labor. It's about the brutal reality of disease. Your longhouse, for all its communal warmth, was a perpetual breeding ground for invisible killers, ensuring that your life, and the lives of those you loved, were constantly hanging by a thread, perpetually vulnerable to the omnipresent, terrifying scourge of sickness, a grim reminder of the profound biological cost of survival in their unyielding northern world. Even if your family managed to avoid the constant ravages of disease within the smoky confines of your longhouse, another, more profound and terrifying specter perpetually haunted your existence. Famine hunger's grip. Forget occasional dietary inconveniences or temporary food shortages. For Vikings, the threat of outright starvation was a constant, existential reality, particularly during harsh, prolonged winters or after a disastrous harvest. You quickly learn that all your efforts at farming, hunting, fishing, and preserving are a desperate, knife-edge gamble against the unforgiving forces of nature, and that the line between survival and succumbing to the gnawing emptiness of hunger is perilously thin. It's like living under a perpetual dark cloud, where any slight shift in the weather or a stroke of bad luck could mean widespread, agonizing starvation for your entire kindred. You feel the familiar ache in your stomach, but now it's a deeper, more persistent gnawing, a hunger that doesn't subside after your meager portion of coarse porridge. Perhaps the winter has been unusually long and cold, locking the land in ice and snow, making hunting impossible and consuming your stored provisions faster than expected. Or maybe a summer harvest was blighted by too much rain, a sudden frost, or a devastating pest infestation, decimating your precious grain yield. Remember those staple grains from Section 2. These are the moments when the shadow of famine lengthens, casting a grim pall over the longhouse and the entire community, turning every empty bowl into a symbol of despair. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the precariousness of Viking family life is that famine was a recurring and devastating threat in the Viking Age, particularly in northern regions with harsh climates, caused by factors like crop failure, severe winters, livestock disease, or disrupted trade, leading to widespread starvation, increased mortality, especially among children and the elderly, and desperate measures for survival. Their food security was always fragile, making them profoundly vulnerable to environmental shifts. Think about it. Your life literally hinges on the weather cooperating and your stored food lasting. Imagine the agonizing choices made as provisions dwindle. You might see your mother or wife, their faces drawn with worry, carefully rationing out smaller and smaller portions of coarse bread or dried fish, trying to make the last supplies stretch for weeks, or even months, longer than they were ever intended to. The children's faces grow gaunt, their usual youthful energy replaced by a quiet, pervasive lethargy. Their small bellies sometimes distended from chronic hunger. Every mouthful of food becomes an intensely precious commodity, consumed slowly, deliberately, knowing that there might not be another for hours, or even days. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the extreme desperation during severe famines is the historical and archaeological evidence of famine foods, plants or materials that would normally be considered inedible or undesirable, but were consumed out of sheer necessity. This could include things like tree bark, especially the inner bark of birch and pine, which could be ground into flour. Remember that from our terrible diet outline. Section 2. Certain types of mosses or lichens, wild roots, or even boiled leather, all providing minimal nutrition but enough to stave off immediate death. Imagine having to chew on a piece of boiled tree bark just to feel something in your stomach. A truly grim culinary low point that shows the depths of their struggle. Historians still argue whether the Viking saga's vivid descriptions of extreme desperation during famines, including rare mentions of cannibalism, particularly in the Greenlandic Norse settlements, were primarily accurate historical accounts reflecting ultimate human desperation, or if they were often embellished cautionary tales intended to highlight moral collapse during times of extreme duress, making it difficult to ascertain the true prevalence of such abhorrent practices. Was it historical fact, or moral fable, that pushed them to such extremes? The effects of prolonged famine are slow and agonizing. Weakness sets in, making daily chores or hunting expeditions incredibly difficult, perpetuating a vicious cycle of hunger and inability to procure food. Your body begins to waste away, drawing on its own reserves. Your immune system, already weakened by the poor diet, becomes highly compromised, making you highly susceptible to any disease that passes through the community. Recall Disease Longhouse's scourge from Section 6, turning a simple cold or a common fever into a fatal illness. The line between hunger and sickness blurs, each exacerbating the other. As the days crawl by, marked only by the relentless gnawing in your stomach and the dwindling daylight of winter, you see the grim toll it takes on your community. Older people, already frail, and especially young children, are often the first to succumb, their fragile bodies unable to withstand the prolonged deprivation. The silence in the longhouse becomes heavier, marked by fewer murmurs, fewer movements, as everyone conserves their precious energy, their lives reduced to a desperate waiting game. The fear of famine was a powerful motivator for all aspects of Viking life. From meticulous food storage, remember that from Section 10 of Terrible Diet, to constant foraging. Section 6 of Terrible Diet, to the drive for raiding and trade, which, as we know from Section 14 of Terrible Diet, provided crucial exotic taste and resources. The quest for new lands, the voyages to distant shores, were often driven by the desperate search for more fertile ground, more reliable resources, a desperate attempt to escape the perpetual shadow of hunger in their homelands. You feel the persistent, dull ache in your stomach, the constant exhaustion, and the profound, chilling understanding that your very existence and that of your family is a constant battle against the empty plate. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about its monotony or its hardships. It's about the ever-present, terrifying threat of famine. Your life is a continuous gamble with the unforgiving climate and unpredictable harvests, making every winter a desperate struggle against the gnawing shadow of hunger. A constant reminder of humanity's enduring vulnerability in the face of nature's harsh indifference, and the ultimate, most brutal price of survival in their unyielding northern world. Even if your family managed to avert the immediate crisis of famine, another dark shadow permeated every aspect of Viking society, often within the very walls of your longhouse slavery ever-present threat. Forget modern notions of freedom. In the Viking Age, the concept of human chattel, the thrall Old Norse for enslaved person, was a deeply ingrained and brutal reality, where individuals could be bought, sold, and forced into relentless labor, their lives utterly at the mercy of their owners. You quickly learn that your family's prosperity might depend on the exploitation of others, and that even your own freedom was a precarious privilege, always vulnerable to the grim prospect of enslavement. It's like living in a world where anyone, including yourself, could suddenly become someone else's property, their life reduced to a mere tool for another's gain. You walk through the longhouse, or perhaps through the fields near your farmstead, and you see them the thralls, Their clothing is typically simpler, coarser, and often marked by signs of hard labor. Their movements might be more subdued, their eyes downcast. They are engaged in every conceivable task, tilling fields, tending livestock, grinding grain, preparing food, cleaning the longhouse, crafting goods, and even caring for children. Their presence is so ubiquitous, so fundamental to the economy and daily life of many Viking families, that they are often overlooked by historical accounts. Yet their suffering underpinned much of the Viking Age prosperity. One mainstream historical fact that utterly contrasts with modern ideals of human rights is that slavery thraldom was a fundamental and pervasive institution in Viking Age society. With thralls, individuals acquired through capture, debt, or birth, having virtually no legal rights, considered the property of their owners, and performing arduous labor across all sectors, from agriculture and crafts to domestic service and even human sacrifice. Their lives were defined by exploitation and lack of freedom, making them the lowest rung of Viking society. Think about it. Your family's social status is partly defined by how many people you own. Imagine the daily existence of a thrall. Their day begins before dawn, often with the hardest, most undesirable tasks. Their food, while often sufficient to keep them alive and productive, would be the cheapest and most basic provisions, likely coarse grain and scraps. Their lodging might be a cramped, unheated space at one end of the longhouse, or a crude shack separate from the main dwelling. There's no privacy, no personal property, and no control over their own bodies or their future. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the brutal, yet sometimes pragmatic, aspects of thraldom is that thralls could sometimes be used as human collateral in legal disputes or as payment for debts. If a free person owed a significant debt they couldn't repay, they might agree to a temporary or permanent period of thraldom for themselves or their children. Imagine your life, or your child's life, being literally a form of currency, capable of being traded to settle a debt. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of widespread large-scale thrall revolts in Viking Age Scandinavia compared to, say, Roman slave rebellions was primarily due to the effectiveness of the control mechanisms and the harsh punishments inflicted upon rebellious thralls, or if it was also a consequence of the relatively smaller numbers of thralls on most individual farmsteads compared to massive Roman estates, making large-scale organization and rebellion more difficult. Was it about control, or sheer numbers, that prevented thrall uprisings? The arbitrary power held by owners over their thralls was absolute. A master could punish a thrall, even brutally, with little or no legal consequence. Flogging, branding, or even death for perceived disobedience or laziness were common. Thralls' families, if they existed, could be separated without warning. Children sold away from parents, spouses from each other. This casual dehumanization was a pervasive aspect of the institution, allowing free Vikings to overlook the inherent brutality. The constant threat of capture and enslavement was also a grim reality for free Vikings, particularly during periods of raiding or interclan conflict. If your village was raided by a rival group, you could find yourself or your family suddenly stripped of freedom, transported far from home, and forced into servitude, your status plummeting overnight. This omnipresent danger meant that no one was truly immune from the specter of becoming a thrall. For families who owned thralls, the presence of these exploited individuals also carried its own burden. While they provided invaluable labor, their misery was a constant, unsettling presence. The owner, too, faced the psychological impact of wielding such absolute power, and the ever-present threat of a desperate thrall attempting escape or even violent rebellion. You feel the grim weight of the thrall's gaze, a silent testament to their suffering, as you move through your longhouse. You observe their stoic endurance, their tireless labor, and the profound sadness in their eyes. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about harsh elements or disease, it's about the brutal reality of slavery. Your family's very comfort and prosperity were often built upon the tireless, exploited labor of thralls, transforming your household into a site of inherent injustice and ensuring that the chilling shadow of forced servitude was a constant, pervasive threat, both for the unfortunate who endured it and for those who, by sheer fortune, remained free. Even within the seemingly secure walls of the longhouse, protected from external raiders or the threats of wild animals, the Viking family unit was not always a haven of peace. Instead, it was often a crucible where everyday tensions, fueled by hardship, honor, and the easy availability of weapons, could erupt into violent domestic dangers. Forget modern notions of protected spaces and legal recourse for assault. In the Viking Age, physical discipline, disputes, and even outright violence within the household were often accepted, if grim, realities. Making your own home a place where conflict, sometimes brutal, was an ever-present possibility. You quickly learn that your family, while your greatest ally, could also be the source of your deepest wounds, and that the line between a heated argument and a physical confrontation was often perilously thin. It's like living in a house where everyone keeps their weapons close, and disagreements can quickly escalate from shouting to shoving, or worse. You observe a heated argument between two family members, perhaps brothers disputing a share of inheritance, or a husband and wife clashing over a decision. Voices rise, tempers flare, and fists might even clench. The air is thick with tension, and the other family members might simply lower their gazes or discreetly move away, accustomed to such outbursts. The close quarters of the longhouse, remember that from Section 1 and 2 intensified every disagreement, making privacy impossible and de-escalation difficult. One mainstream historical fact that utterly contrasts with modern standards of domestic peace is that physical discipline of children and thralls enslaved individuals, and even instances of marital or familial violence, were often accepted within Viking Age society, as long as they remained within certain customary boundaries, though these were broad and subjective, with legal recourse for victims often limited or dependent on familial support. The concept of domestic violence as a crime against the individual, rather than a family dispute, was largely absent. Think about it: a slap from your father might just be considered teaching you a lesson. Imagine the subtle dynamics. A father might physically discipline his child, not out of malice, but to instill obedience, resilience, and preparedness for the harsh realities of Viking life. Remember, childhood short, brutal, dangerous. Section 2. A thrall from Section 8 might be beaten by their owner for perceived laziness or disobedience, an accepted right of property ownership. You might witness such an act, and your instinct would be to avert your eyes, knowing that intervention could risk your own safety or worsen the situation for the victim. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the nuanced and sometimes violent legal landscape surrounding domestic disputes is the specific legal provisions in the Icelandic sagas which, while not universal, offer insights into Norse law for a wife to divorce her husband in cases of physical abuse, especially if he struck her 3 times or more, or if the blows left visible marks. This suggests a recognition of abuse, even if the solution was often separation rather than legal punishment of the abuser. Imagine a legal code that allowed you to divorce your husband, but only after he hit you enough times to leave a lasting mark, implying that lesser blows were just part of marital life. Historians still argue whether the apparent acceptance of certain levels of domestic violence in Viking Age society was primarily a reflection of a deeply patriarchal warrior culture where physical prowess and a quick temper were valued, making violence a common response to conflict. Or if the sagas and legal codes, by documenting such acts and offering some recourse like divorce, were actually attempts to regulate violence and maintain social order in a fundamentally unstable society, rather than simply endorsing brutality. Was it inherent brutality, or an attempt to control it, that shaped domestic conflict? Conflicts within the family could escalate rapidly, particularly over matters of honor, a profound concept for Vikings, as seen in Viking Justice, Section 1 and 6, Inheritance, or property disputes. A heated argument could quickly turn to shoving, then to punches, and in a society where weapons were readily available, even to the drawing of knives or axes. While outright murder within the family would be a grave crime, lesser assaults might be seen as regrettable but understandable consequences of passionate disputes. Perhaps to be settled informally rather than through formal legal channels, remember that Fragmented Justice System Section 5. The close quarters of the longhouse meant that personal space was minimal, and tensions could easily fester. There was little opportunity to cool off or retreat from an argument. Every dispute, every act of physical discipline, every moment of familial conflict played out within earshot of everyone else, adding to the pervasive, low-level stress of communal living. Children, growing up in this environment, would be constantly exposed to physical conflict, both as recipients of discipline and as witnesses to adult disputes. This undoubtedly contributed to their resilience and their understanding of the harsh realities of their world, but also to a normalized view of violence as a part of daily life. You feel the tension in the air, the coldness that descends after a harsh word, or the sudden surge of fear when a dispute turns physical. You try to keep your own temper in check, knowing the easy escalation of conflict. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about harsh elements or economic struggle. It's about the pervasive, often brutal, reality of domestic dangers. Your family, while your shield against the outside world, was also a crucible of internal conflict, where accepted levels of physical discipline and the easy escalation of disputes made your own home a place where violence, subtle or overt, was an ever-present possibility, a constant reminder of the raw, unforgiving nature of human relationships in their challenging northern world. Even if your Viking family endured the physical rigors of daily toil and the tensions of domestic disputes, time, that relentless thief, brought its own unique challenge to the household elderly burden or wisdom. Forget modern retirement homes or guaranteed social security. In the Viking Age, the position of aging family members was often precarious, a delicate balance between their accumulated wisdom and their declining physical ability, turning their golden years into a potential struggle for survival and dignity in a world that valued strength and productivity above all else. You quickly learn that growing old here is not a serene winding down, but a challenging transition, where your value to the kindred could determine your comfort, or your very fate. It's like being a senior partner in a very tough, very demanding family business, where if you can't pull your weight, your share of the profits might dwindle or disappear entirely. You observe the older members of your longhouse, your aging parents, perhaps a grandparent, or an elderly aunt or uncle. Their movements might be slower, their backs bent by a lifetime of hard labor, their eyes dimmed by age. They sit by the hearth more often, their hands gnarled by arthritis. Remember those dental problems from Section 12 of the terrible diet and their impact on overall health. Section 13. Their voices perhaps weakened. While outwardly respected for their experience and knowledge, their physical decline presents a profound challenge to a family whose very survival hinges on collective productivity. One mainstream historical fact that utterly contrasts with modern concepts of guaranteed elder care is that the well-being of elderly individuals in the Viking Age was largely dependent on their continued usefulness to the family unit. Edges, advising, childcare, light tasks, storytelling, and the economic capacity and willingness of their kindred to support them. With those unable to contribute, sometimes facing neglect or a precarious existence in a society that prioritized physical strength and productivity, their survival was not guaranteed by state or formal institutions. Think about it. Your retirement plan is literally whether your children still want you around. Imagine the dilemma. An elderly grandparent might no longer be able to swing an axe, tend the fields, or haul heavy buckets of water. Their direct physical contribution to the household's labor, so vital in earlier years, begins to wane. This creates a tension. They consume resources, food, warmth, a place to sleep, but their ability to replenish those resources diminishes. In lean times, remember the constant threat of famine from Section 7. This could make them a perceived burden on a struggling family already battling for its own survival. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the precarious balance of wisdom versus burden is the widespread practice of elderly individuals serving as storytellers and keepers of oral tradition. In a pre-literate society, the elders were living libraries, repositories of sagas, genealogies, laws. Remember those lawmen bearers of lore from Viking justice, Section 7, and practical knowledge passed down through generations. Their wisdom, their ability to entertain and instruct, was a valuable, non-physical contribution that could secure their place and respect in the family. Imagine your grandmother being your primary source of history, entertainment, and legal advice, all rolled into one, because she's the only one who remembers everything. Historians still argue whether the apparent reverence for elderly wisdom in Viking sagas and poetic traditions, Odin's pursuit of knowledge from ancient beings truly reflected a consistent societal value that ensured the well-being of all elders, or if it was often an idealized portrayal, masking a harsher reality where those without unique knowledge or who became utterly infirm were often marginalized or faced neglect in times of scarcity, regardless of their past contributions. Was it inherent respect or practical utility that defined their later years? The care of the elderly involved significant effort, particularly if they became infirm or bedridden. They needed assistance with daily tasks, warmth, and sustenance, drawing on the limited resources of the longhouse, family members. Typically, women remember their endless toil. Section 4 would bear the primary burden of their care. This compassion, while deeply rooted in family bonds, came at a cost in a world of constant struggle. The position of an aging gaudy chieftain or a wealthy farmer might be more secure due to their accumulated wealth and social influence, ensuring their comfort in old age. But for the average peasant or artisan, whose life was defined by physical labor, the onset of old age brought profound vulnerability. The death of adult children, or a string of bad harvests, could leave an elderly couple utterly destitute and dependent on distant kin or the tenuous charity of the community. You feel the cold dread of old age, the chilling realization that your worth might one day be measured by your inability to contribute, rather than your lifetime of labor. You watch an elder, revered for his wisdom, yet visibly frail. His slow movements a stark reminder of life's eventual decline. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about childhood struggles or marital negotiations. It's about the precarious reality of the elderly. Your golden years would be a delicate balance between wisdom and perceived burden, transforming your twilight years into a constant struggle for dignity and survival, a chilling reminder that in a world valuing strength and productivity, the price of age was often profound vulnerability and dependence on the uncertain compassion of your own family. Even if your Viking family somehow managed to navigate the brutal challenges of childhood, the strategic demands of marriage, the relentless toil of women, the anxieties of men's absence, the unseen scourge of disease, the constant threat of famine, and the precarious position of the elderly, one ultimate, inescapable reality defined every life, shaping family bonds and the very nature of grief. Death constant companion. Forget the sanitized, distant encounters with mortality of your modern world. In the Viking Age, death was a pervasive, intimate, and often sudden presence, claiming loved ones young and old, forcing families to confront loss with a grim frequency that profoundly altered their experience of grief and the bonds of kinship. You quickly learn that your family tree is constantly shedding leaves, and that every embrace might be a final one, making the very act of loving a deeply risky, yet unavoidable, endeavor. It's like living in a perpetual state of quiet mourning, where every new face brings joy, but also the chilling knowledge that it too will eventually disappear. You sit by the hearth, the usual sounds of the longhouse hushed. A family member, perhaps a child, remember that horrifyingly high infant mortality from Section 2, or an elder whose precarious position we just explored in Section 10, or even a robust warrior cut down by disease or violence has succumbed. The body lies still, perhaps covered by a simple shroud. The air is heavy with sorrow, but also with a grim familiarity. Death is not a stranger here. It is a frequent, unwelcome visitor, a constant companion throughout life. One mainstream historical fact that utterly contrasts with modern life expectancy is that mortality rates in the Viking Age were exceptionally high across all age groups, leading to a drastically shorter average lifespan, often in the 30s-40s compared to modern times, and making death a frequent, intimate, and unavoidable experience within families, shaping their social structures, emotional responses to loss, and spiritual beliefs about the afterlife. Death was woven into the fabric of daily existence. Think about it, you would likely attend more funerals than birthdays. Imagine the different forms death could take. An infant might simply fade away in the night, a victim of unseen illness or malnutrition linking back to those diseases from Section 6 and the grip of famine from Section 7. A child might succumb to a fever, or perish in a domestic accident, the dangers of the longhouse, with open fires and sharp tools, were ever present. A man might never return from a long, dangerous voyage of trade or raid. Remember men's absence from Section 5, lost to storms. Battle, think of the brutal reality of medieval warfare, or disease, those awful conditions on Viking ships. A woman might die in childbirth, a horrifying reality, as we explored in a previous episode. The horrifying childbirth practices of the Middle Ages. Even the elderly, if they survived, faced precarious circumstances, often succumbing to the harsh winters or the general decline of old age. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the Vikings' pragmatic and often direct approach to death is the tradition of holding elaborate funeral feasts. Gravul, or ale of the grave, after a burial. These weren't just about mourning. They were also social gatherings to confirm an inheritance, make political alliances, and simply for the living to carry on. Imagine burying your loved one and then throwing a party to solidify your family's new power structure, often with copious amounts of ale and feasting. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism and resilience of Viking communities in the face of such pervasive mortality was primarily a result of a deeply ingrained fatalistic worldview believing in ward or fate that minimized overt grieving, or if the frequent exposure to death simply led to different, less public, expressions of sorrow, with profound grief still experienced but expressed in more private and ritualistic ways, ensuring the community could continue to function. Did it make them stoic, or just adapt their grief? The rituals surrounding death were profound, but also practical. The body would be washed and dressed, sometimes in fine clothes. Burial practices varied, from simple inhumation burial in the ground to elaborate ship burials for chieftains with vast tomb goods and even sacrificed animals, similar to those disturbing funeral rites of ancient Egypt. The focus was on preparing the deceased for the journey to the afterlife, to Valhalla or Helheim, ensuring their honor and their connection to their ancestors. The constant presence of death shaped family bonds in unique ways. Those who survived formed stronger, perhaps more fiercely protective ties, knowing how quickly loved ones could be lost. Each new birth, each successful return from a voyage, each winter weathered, was a cause for quiet celebration, a defiance against the ever-present shadow of mortality. Yet, the emotional toll of frequent loss, of witnessing so much suffering, must have been immense, leading to a profound sense of grim realism about the fragility of life. You feel the cold silence that settles over the longhouse after a death, the communal grief, and the chilling awareness that your own time, and the time of those around you, is limited. You watch as a loved one is prepared for burial, their final journey, knowing that one day it will be your turn. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about the hardships of daily survival. It's about the pervasive, intimate reality of death. Your existence is a continuous cycle of life and loss, making mortality a constant companion that profoundly shaped every bond, every act of grief, and every moment of fragile joy, ensuring that the heavy price of living in their unyielding northern world was a life lived in the enduring shadow of universal death. Even as the Longhouse grappled with the pervasive reality of death and its profound impact on family bonds, one of the most heartbreaking consequences of high mortality was the grim fate of the most vulnerable orphanhood precarious survival. Forget modern social services or protected foster care. In the Viking Age, a child left without parents, particularly a father, faced a profoundly difficult and uncertain future, often dependent on the uncertain charity of their kindred, risking destitution, exploitation, or even enslavement. You quickly learn that losing your parents here isn't just an emotional tragedy. It's an immediate, existential threat, forcing you to navigate a harsh world with vastly diminished protection. It's like being a tiny boat cut adrift in a stormy sea, with only the distant hope of a tenuous lifeline from a distant relative. You might see a child, barely past infancy, remember how brutal childhood was. From Section 2, now sitting quietly by the hearth, their eyes wide with confusion and sorrow. Their parents have succumbed to disease, recall those Longhouse's scourge illnesses from Section 6, or perhaps their father never returned from a long, dangerous voyage. Remember men's absence raids and trade from Section 5. Whatever the cause, they are now an orphan, their immediate future hanging precariously in the balance. The longhouse, once a bustling hub of activity, now feels colder, quieter, marked by the absence of their protectors. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines the grim reality for orphaned children is that orphans in the Viking Age, particularly those without a strong, willing kindred to absorb them, faced immense hardship, including increased vulnerability to poverty, malnutrition, and exploitation, with some even being sold into temporary or permanent thraldom slavery by desperate relatives as a last resort for survival. Their survival was highly dependent on the strength and compassion of their extended family. Think about it. Your safety net is entirely dependent on whether your distant uncle wants to take on an extra mouth to feed. Imagine the immediate challenges. Without parents, the child loses their primary providers, protectors, and educators. Their claim to land or property might be tenuous, especially if there are other, more powerful, relatives vying for it. Their access to food, already precarious in a Viking diet, remember those constant struggles with famine from Section 7, becomes even more uncertain. They might become dependents, relying entirely on the goodwill of their remaining kindred, which could fluctuate with the family's own fortunes. A particularly quirky tidbit that reflects the legal and social efforts to provide for orphans, however imperfectly, is the existence of specific laws in some Norse legal codes, like the Icelandic Gragas, regarding the guardianship and inheritance rights of orphans. These laws, while progressive for their time, often still left orphans vulnerable to exploitation, as guardians might mismanage their inheritance or even profit from their labor. Imagine a legal document meticulously detailing your inheritance, but then the person managing it is also your guardian, and they might just decide to keep it for themselves. Historians still argue whether the legal provisions for orphans in Viking Age society, by establishing formal guardianship and inheritance rights, truly provided a vital safety net that protected a significant number of vulnerable children from extreme destitution and exploitation. Or if these laws were often difficult to enforce in practice, with many orphans still falling through the cracks and enduring lives of hardship, making legal protection more theoretical than real. Did the laws help? Or did they just show how terrible the reality was? The child's integration into a new household, even if it was that of a close relative, could be challenging. They might be treated differently than the natural children of the family, given harder chores, or provided with less food or warmth. Their status, now that of a dependent, was inherently precarious. They would miss the warmth of their parents, the familiar routines, and the secure place they once held in the household. The threat of exploitation was constant. A desperate relative, or an unscrupulous neighbor, might take advantage of an orphan's vulnerability, putting them to work in arduous tasks, or even, in dire circumstances, selling them into thraldom slavery. Remember that brutal reality from Section 8. This was a grim last resort, but one that occurred, turning a child into mere property for survival. The psychological toll on an orphaned child would be immense. They experienced profound loss, compounded by insecurity, neglect, and the constant fear of what tomorrow might bring. Their childhood, already brutal and short from Section 2, would be utterly stripped of its already meager innocence, forcing them into premature adulthood and relentless self-reliance. You feel the profound sadness of a child who has lost their protectors, the quiet fear in their eyes, and the chilling realization that their precarious survival hangs by the thinnest thread of circumstance. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about the hardships adults faced. It's about the brutal reality of orphanhood. Your existence as a child without parents would be defined by vulnerability, dependence, and the constant struggle for basic survival, transforming your tragic loss into a continuous fight against destitution and exploitation, ensuring that the heavy price of mortality was often paid most cruelly by the most innocent members of Viking society. Even if a child managed to survive the precariousness of orphanhood, and the family unit somehow held together against external threats, the Viking longhouse was not immune to internal rot. This brings us to disputes, feuds, and ostracism. Forget polite disagreements or mediated family counseling. In the Viking Age, unresolved conflicts within the family or between related kindreds could rapidly escalate into bitter, violent feuds, leading to property disputes, physical assaults, and even outright killings, turning internal tensions into open warfare that could shatter a family and condemn individuals to the terrifying solitude of social exile. You quickly learn that your closest kin, those you rely on for survival, can also be your most dangerous enemies, and that a family argument might literally end in bloodshed or social annihilation. It's like living in a reality TV show where the family drama frequently involves murder, and the ultimate punishment is being completely ignored by everyone you know, forever. You observe a simmering tension in the longhouse. Perhaps it's a dispute over inheritance after the death of a patriarch, with brothers squabbling over land or livestock, or a perceived insult to the honor of one family member, demanding satisfaction. Voices rise, tempers flare, and the air crackles with unspoken threats. The communal nature of the longhouse. Remember that from Section 1 meant that personal disputes quickly became public, drawing in other family members and forcing sides to be chosen. One mainstream historical fact that utterly contrasts with modern notions of family harmony is that Viking Age society, particularly in regions like Iceland, where sagas document this extensively, frequently experienced brutal and prolonged blood feuds, vig or drap, between families or clans over matters of honor, property, or unresolved grievances, often involving retaliatory killings, physical assaults, and economic destruction. Where traditional legal systems struggled to contain the violence, family conflict often escalated into open warfare. Think about it. Your family reunion could literally turn into a brawl. But with axes, imagine the escalation. An initial insult might lead to a public challenge. A minor property dispute could result in a physical altercation, a shove, a punch. If blood is drawn, or honor is deeply stained, the cycle of vengeance begins. One family member might respond by raiding the other's livestock. The aggrieved party would retaliate, perhaps by burning down a barn, or even by striking down the offending family member. The concept of an eye for an eye was a brutal, self-perpetuating reality. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates the meticulous legal and often vengeful nature of these feuds is the detailed recording of killings and counter-killings in the Icelandic sagas. Families would keep a literal tally of who had killed whom, meticulously tracking their obligations for revenge or compensation, sometimes over generations. Imagine having a family tree, but instead of birth dates, it's a ledger of who killed who, and whose turn it is for revenge. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of blood feuds in Viking Age society, despite their destructive nature, inadvertently served as a form of social control and a primitive justice system in a decentralized society lacking strong central authority. That from Why Justice Sucked. Section 2 about feudal lords' arbitrary justice, ensuring that serious transgressions would not go unpunished, or if they fundamentally undermined social stability, leading to endemic violence and the constant dissipation of resources. Did it maintain order, or just cause chaos? The goal of a feud was often not just to inflict harm, but to compel the offending party to pay compensation vergilde. Remember that from Section 7 of Viking justice, or to force them into exile. But often, the cycle of violence became an end in itself, driven by pride, grief, and an unyielding commitment to family honor. Entire kindreds could be decimated by a prolonged feud, draining their manpower, their wealth, and their very spirit. Ostracism, a form of social exile, was another brutal consequence of internal disputes or severe transgressions against communal norms. If an individual or even a family committed acts deemed unacceptable by the wider kindred or community, they could be cut off, shunned, denied aid, and essentially left to fend for themselves. This was a terrifying fate in a society where survival depended entirely on communal support. You recall how severe outlawry was from Section 14 of Why Justice Sucked. This was a family-level version of that, just as devastating. You feel the coldness that descends when a family argument turns bitter, the palpable tension in the air as lines are drawn, and the chilling realization that those closest to you can become your deadliest adversaries. You watch a family fracture, knowing that the ripples of this dispute could spread through generations, costing lives and livelihoods. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about external threats or shared hardships. It's about the brutal reality of internal disputes. Your family, while your only shield, could also be the source of your deepest, most enduring wounds, turning intimate conflicts into devastating feuds and social ostracism, ensuring that the heavy price of loyalty, or its absence, was often paid in blood and profound isolation. A constant reminder of the raw, unforgiving nature of human relationships in their challenging northern world. Even if your family managed to avoid the devastating consequences of internal feuds, the daily reality of your Viking longhouse was an ongoing, often unseen, battle against another pervasive enemy: hygiene-shared filth. Forget sparkling clean surfaces, running water, or the constant use of soaps and sanitizers. The Viking home, while a crucial shelter from the elements, was often a crowded, smoky, and fundamentally unsanitary environment, breeding grounds for vermin and disease. You quickly learn that cleanliness is a relative concept, and that living in close quarters with humans, animals, and their waste is simply an unavoidable, often unpleasant, part of daily existence, making your very home a constant source of unseen misery. It's like living in a permanent, very cozy, but utterly contaminated barn, where the air is thick with smoke and the floor is constantly interesting. You wake each morning, or return from a day's labor, and the smell of the longhouse hits you. It's a pervasive mix of wood smoke from the central hearth. Remember that from Section 1. Stale sweat, unwashed bodies, drying animal hides, food scraps, and the subtle, earthy odor of human and animal waste. This isn't a fleeting smell. It's the constant, unavoidable aroma of communal living, intensified by the lack of proper ventilation. The floors of the longhouse are typically earthen, or sometimes covered with straw or rushes, which were rarely changed. These organic coverings, while providing insulation and a softer surface than bare earth, quickly became breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and other vermin. They absorbed spilled food, animal droppings, and human waste, creating a perpetually dirty environment that was impossible to truly sanitize. One mainstream historical fact that utterly contrasts with modern notions of household cleanliness is that Viking Age longhouses, designed for communal living with humans and often livestock, lacked modern sanitation, running water, and proper waste disposal, leading to extremely unhygienic conditions with pervasive filth, vermin infestations, and poor air quality, contributing to widespread disease within families. Their homes were shelters, but also constant sources of contamination. Imagine trying to maintain personal hygiene. Bathing was infrequent, often limited to a quick rinse in a cold stream during warmer months, or a more elaborate, yet still basic. Wash in heated water during winter. Soap, as you know it, didn't exist. Basic cleansing involved alkaline ashes or rudimentary lye soap if made. Clothes were often worn for weeks, even months, without thorough washing, becoming perpetually grimy and infested with lice and fleas. You would constantly feel itchy, constantly feel a bit grimy, no matter how hard you tried to scrub yourself with coarse cloths and cold water. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates their pragmatic approach to personal care and possibly to managing odors is the discovery of ear spoons and tweezers among Viking artifacts, suggesting that while full-body bathing was rare, they did pay attention to certain aspects of personal grooming. Imagine carrying around a tiny spoon just for your ears, knowing the rest of you is perpetually grimy, and hoping that's enough to make you presentable. Historians still argue whether the extreme levels of filth and unhygienic practices within Viking longhouses, while seemingly detrimental to health, were an unavoidable consequence of technological limitations and climate, or if Viking communities developed some forms of natural resilience or symbiotic relationships with their microbial environment over generations, meaning their bodies were simply better adapted to a higher pathogenic load than modern humans would be. Did it make them sick? Or were they just built differently? Waste disposal within the longhouse was rudimentary. Human waste might be collected in chamber pots, whose contents were then often simply emptied outside, near the dwelling, or into a communal pit, contributing to the general unsanitary conditions around the home. Animal waste, from any livestock housed in one end of the longhouse, also accumulated, adding to the pervasive stench and attracting more flies and pests. The constant presence of flies, buzzing around your face, landing on your food. Remember those awful meals. From Section 5, and contaminating everything, was a relentless, maddening nuisance. The smoke from the central hearth, while essential for heating and cooking, also filled the longhouse with constant soot. It coated the walls, the ceiling, your clothes, and your lungs. This poor air quality contributed significantly to respiratory problems within the family. Remember Disease Longhouse's scourge from Section 6, turning your warm shelter into a constant source of internal irritation. You feel the persistent itch of unseen bites, the grit on your teeth, and the constant low-level nausea from the pervasive smells. You try to air out the longhouse or sit near the smoke hole to get a breath of clearer air, but the filth is constant, inescapable. You watch as children play on the dirty floors, oblivious to the invisible dangers, and you wonder how anyone truly survives without constant sickness. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age isn't just about harsh elements or dangerous voyages. It's about the pervasive, grim reality of hygiene. Your longhouse, for all its communal warmth and protection, was a shared crucible of filth, constantly infested with pests and permeated by foul odors. Your daily existence was a relentless battle against dirt, disease, and the pervasive presence of human and animal waste, transforming your home into a constant source of misery. A chilling reminder that even the most basic comforts of modern life were utterly unattainable, and that cleanliness, in the Viking Age, was a luxury that few could ever truly know. After enduring the brutal realities of childhood, the strategic demands of marriage, the relentless toil of women, the anxieties of men's absence, the unseen scourge of disease, the constant threat of famine, the harsh reality of slavery, the tensions of domestic violence, the precarious position of the elderly, the pervasive presence of death, the grim fate of orphans, the bitter reality of family feuds, and the pervasive filth of communal living. You finally emerge from our journey through Viking family life to confront its complex and enduring legacy toughness. Short lives, the daily hardships, the constant dangers, and the relentless demands of their environment undeniably shaped the very character, resilience, and ultimate fate of the Viking people. Forging a reputation for formidable hardiness, but also contributing to lives that were often far shorter, more painful, and more brutal than we might ever imagine. You realize that the very essence of Viking strength was born from the crucible of profound suffering, etching a grim reality into the very fabric of their existence. It's like looking at a gnarled, ancient tree, battered by centuries of storms, and realizing its very strength comes from every single struggle it endured. You reflect on the raw, unvarnished truth of their lives, the constant gnawing of hunger, the persistent aches from hard labor, the unseen parasites in their bodies, the ever-present threat of violence from within and without. These were not occasional challenges. They were the defining features of their daily existence. Yet, through it all, they endured. They built communities, sailed vast oceans, forged complex legal systems. Remember that Viking justice from a previous segment, and created a vibrant culture that continues to fascinate us. One mainstream historical fact that utterly defines this paradoxical legacy is that despite a diet often prone to deficiencies, pervasive disease, and a life characterized by immense physical hardship and frequent violence, Viking Age populations developed remarkable resilience and adaptability, enabling them to survive harsh environments and expand across vast territories. Though archaeological evidence consistently points to a significantly shorter average lifespan, often 30 to 50 years compared to later periods. Their renowned hardiness came at a very high biological cost. Think about it. They were tough as nails, but those nails were often rusted and prone to snapping. Imagine the traits forged by such a life, a profound pragmatism born from constant struggle, an unshakable resilience in the face of adversity, and a deep, fierce loyalty to their kindred family group, which was often their only true safety net. The men's relentless pursuit of trade and raids. Remember, men's absence. Section 5. The women's tireless management of the household. Section 4. The children's early entry into labor. Section 2. All contributed to a collective toughness that allowed them to survive and even thrive in an unforgiving world. A particularly quirky tidbit that demonstrates their grim resourcefulness and how it literally affected their bodies is the archaeological evidence of severe dental wear. Not just from coarse grains, but sometimes from using teeth as tools for tasks like softening leather. Remember, dental health gnawing truth from our terrible diet script. Section 12. This physical manifestation of their daily grind speaks volumes about their toughness, a hardiness that literally wore down their bodies. Imagine your teeth being worn down not just by eating, but by using them as pliers, a testament to how every part of their body was a tool for survival. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' remarkable expansion and exploration to places like North America were primarily enabled by their sheer physical hardiness and daring spirit, making them uniquely suited to endure such long, dangerous voyages, or if their constant need for resources like land, food, or plunder. driven by the severe limitations and hardships of their domestic life, was a more fundamental driving force that compelled them to constantly push beyond their known world. Was it their toughness or their desperation that led them to explore so widely? However, this undeniable hardiness came with a profound and undeniable cost: a dramatically shortened lifespan. Disease, accidents, violence, and the cumulative effects of a nutritionally challenging diet recall the disease from diet scurvy's reach. Section 13 meant that few Vikings lived into old age. Those who did often faced a precarious existence, their strength waning, remember, elderly burden or wisdom. Section 10. Every family experienced profound loss with grim frequency, shaping their view of life and death. Section 11. The legacy of Viking family life, therefore, is a complex one. It's not a story of idyllic domesticity, but of raw, unvarnished struggle. It reminds us that behind the epic sagas and the gleaming artifacts lies a human reality of relentless toil, constant peril, and deep suffering. Yet, it also reveals the incredible resilience of the human spirit, the enduring strength of family bonds forged in hardship, and the ingenuity born of sheer necessity. The ability to endure, to adapt, to survive against overwhelming odds is the true, powerful legacy of the Viking family. A hard-won triumph over a world that ceaselessly tried to break them. You stand now, reflecting on the profound journey through their grim domesticity. The awful truth about family life in the Viking Age is precisely what makes its legacy so compelling. It is the harshness, the constant battle for survival, and the ubiquitous presence of suffering that illuminates the true depth of their hardiness and resilience, forever etching their story into the very fabric of human endurance. Their short lives, lived with fierce determination, serve as a stark reminder of the immense price paid for existence in a challenging and unforgiving world, a testament to how even the bonds of family were constantly forged and tested in the crucible of daily struggle. Now, as the smoky longhouse hearth fades and the echoes of Viking family life grow quiet, let the stillness of your room embrace you. The hardships of childhood, the strategic marriages, the endless toil, and the constant presence of disease and death are safely in the past, part of a history that now dissolves into the gentle hum of your fan. You've journeyed through a world where even family bonds were forged in the fires of necessity. And now, it's time for you to find your own peaceful rest. Let your mind unwind, your muscles relax, and sink into a deep, undisturbed sleep, far from the harsh realities of a Viking longhouse. End of script. Sweet dreams.